koto katoa. Warm greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Connect and Develop series. I'm Joel Terwilliger, Alumni Relations Manager at the University of Auckland. It's my great pleasure to be with you today for this last talk of the series. If it's your first time tuning in, thanks for being here. For those of you that joined a previous talk, it's good to have you back. The accelerated rate of change in the world of work requires more continuous learning throughout our careers. And the Connect and Develop series is here to bring you tools that can help you do just that and get ahead of the curve. Today's topic, going beyond cultural competence, global insights on equity and diversity, holds particular importance as workforces and the work they undertake often span multiple continents or stakeholders. And addressing complex societal challenges requires collaboration across cultural, sectoral, and physical boundaries. Our speaker, Claire Achmad, is joining us today from Wellington and is the Chief Executive Officer of social service providers Aotearoa. She was inducted into the university's 40 Under 40 Humanitarians in 2018 for her long-standing services toward advancing and protecting the rights and well-being of children and youth in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and globally. I'm joining Claire today as your MC. In my capacity as Alumni Relations Manager, I develop, lead, and contribute to strategies and projects that connect, engage, celebrate, and support the university's global community of over 200,000. Over the past decade, I've worked with universities, government officials, civil society, and constituents across the world to develop and launch both global and local communications, volunteering, and constituent engagement programs. Because of the global nature of my work, I've seen firsthand the importance of authentic cross-cultural collaboration that considers the diverse perspectives of the people our organizations employ and serve. I hope that today's talk gives us some valuable food for thought as we consider our role in fostering more equitable and inclusive workplaces. I'm going to share a bit more about Claire in a moment. We'll then have a brief discussion together before opening it up toward the end to answer your questions. On behalf of all of us here at the university, I'd like to take a moment to express our thanks to Claire for being a part of this series. And just a few quick tips for participating today before I finish introducing Claire. The Q&A function at the bottom of your on-screen Zoom panel is live. Please submit your questions at any time and we'll be checking them as we go. Also, please do upvote any questions you find interesting. These questions will move to the top of the Q&A screen. And toward the end of today's webinar, Claire will be answering some of the most popular ones. And now on to introducing our speaker, Claire Achmad. In her role as CEO of social service providers Aotearoa, she represents the New Zealand community social services and champions the outcomes that social service workers are creating every day in communities around the country, alongside families and whānau. Prior to her current role, she has held several senior roles at Barnardo's New Zealand, World Vision Australia, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, UNICEF Netherlands, and the New Zealand Ministry of Social Development, working as a dedicated advocate across a range of child and human rights issues to develop more equal, just, and sustainable communities. She also serves in advisory and leadership roles with New Zealand and international organizations, including Child Identity Protection in Geneva, the New Zealand Children's Commissioner, Shelterbox New Zealand, Children's Rights Alliance Aotearoa, and Asia New Zealand Foundation, in addition to lecturing, advising, and publishing internationally. So without further ado, over to you, Claire.
Great, Joel, and thanks so much for that very warm introduction. No ko te mana airani mea Indonesia toku oku tupuna. I te taha o toku whaia no airani me ko te mana. I te taha o toku matua no Indonesia aho. I whānau aho i te maru o te maunga o Waitakere, I tipo ake aho i te kainga o te taha o te awa o te whau. Ko te whanganui atara e noho ana nai nei. Ko Robin Rawa ko Bambang o ku matua, ko Anaru tuku Tungane, ko Peter tuku Hoa Rangatira, ko Claire Achmad tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's such a pleasure to have the chance to be in kōrero with you, Joel, this afternoon, and with everyone who's joining us from around Tamaki Makaurau and around the Motu. Thank you for making the time to come and be a part of this really important topic and conversation today, and I'm looking forward to a good exchange with one another. Also just want to acknowledge the University of Auckland for creating this Connect and Develop series. It's a great opportunity for everyone, whether you are a student, someone who's already in the workplace, or maybe looking to make a change in your career, to have that chance to learn and develop. And I know that the topics that have been discussed over the past few weeks have been really interesting. I also want to acknowledge that I know for many who are joining today, there are ongoing impacts of the pandemic that we're experiencing, and especially just want to acknowledge all the whānau in Tamaki Makaurau today. I know it's been a really hard time. So today with my kōrero, I'm going to be really focusing in on this kaupapa of diversity and equity, and a focus on cultural competence. We'll be looking at why this kaupapa is important. What is it? Why is it important? And how can you contribute to this in your work? So that's sort of the roadmap for our conversation this afternoon and where we'll go together. And I also just want to acknowledge before I get underway, sharing a bit more of my own whakaaro, that there's a lot of expertise that will sit amongst the that's gathered virtually here today. So I really want to acknowledge that everyone actually brings expertise and experience to this conversation. And I really invite you to get involved in the Q&A and the chat, your thoughts in the function there on Zoom that we can use today, so that it really is an inclusive conversation. I've got a few slides that I'm going to share. But before I do, I just want to share a few words about why this kaupapa really matters to me personally, and why it's such a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you all about it today. The first thing, I guess, is the nature of my work. As you heard from Joel, my career has been focused in social justice and human rights, both internationally and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I've seen through my work, especially with children and young people, the importance of inclusivity and equity, and what it looks like when we actually are embracing of diversity in our societies and in our communities. I've also seen through my work the incredible things that can happen when we work inclusively and collaboratively with one another across cultural boundaries. It really does make a huge difference, and I'm sure that some of you have already seen that yourself in your work and your studies and careers to date as well. I've also been fortunate to work both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also internationally with a real range of cultures and cultural experiences. And I know that for me, that has been incredibly culturally enriching as a person, and it's opened my mind to different ways of thinking about the world. And then at a very personal level, I also know what it's like to be one of the different voices in the room. When I started out working as a lawyer in government, I was one of the only much younger females working in my team and my workplace. And so I know some of the challenges that come with having my voice heard around a table. And also I am of dual heritage as well. So I also know what that can feel like. And so I bring some of these personal experiences to this conversation today. So I'm just going to share my screen now with a few slides. Just bear with me for one moment while I just get that up. All right, so hopefully everyone can see a lovely picture there of a person looking up to a beautiful starlit sky. And you'll see here that I've popped on the slides the words ao huri huri. And what this means in our beautiful language of Te Reo Māori is the changing world. And I just wanted to start today by talking a little bit about the context that we are working in our workplaces today, both here in Aotearoa and around the world. We are really living in an ever-changing world. And there are a few different things that characterise this. We are incredibly globally connected, and even though the pandemic has had an impact on that, we still, here in Aotearoa and in other parts of the world, live and work with diverse cultures around us all day, every day. We're also in a world that's facing a really fast pace of change, uncertainty and complexity. And what comes with that in our societies is also that some people feel a lack of inclusion and belonging. We have struggles with inequity and injustice. And also we're happily starting to see a change in regard to some of these things. We're starting to see some walls coming down, a slow but definitely happening process of decolonisation. Deconstructing systemic racism that has been built into our societies for far too long. And now as well, in this changing world, we have the added layer, of course, of the pandemic that we are dealing with. So these things are all relevant in all aspects of our lives, including the workplace. And in my mind, this changing nature of things means that we really have to be equipped to work effectively within change and hopefully to make a positive difference through the work that we are doing. And today, to be really effective in our work, we also need to know what it means to work equitably and inclusively. So that is a key part of this. Whenever I'm looking to hire someone for my team or organisation, a competence that I'm really interested in is, are they able to work within this context of change, and also are they able to work effectively across cultures and also across diversity with a whole wide range of people, because if you are able to bring that competence to your work, you're going to be much more effective in your organisation and your workplace and in doing what you do. And of course, the other thing that I want to briefly mention in this context setting piece of my talk today is that in Aotearoa, we of course have Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And Te Tiriti is a promise between two peoples, essentially, between the tangata whenua Māori of the land and Tauiwi, people from another land, who have made essentially a promise about how we will live together with one another. And even though that agreement was made in 1840 between Māori and the Crown, all of us who have come to Aotearoa since, as tauiwi, have a role to uphold and give effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So that is another key aspect of working in Aotearoa, and it's especially important when we're talking about inclusion and diversity and cultural competence. So I wonder if I can just ask everyone where you are, just to think for a moment about a time where you felt excluded or judged or wrong. Just recall that feeling. I think that most of us have had an experience such as this in our lives. And I know certainly for myself that it's not a good feeling to have. So now I wonder if you can think of a time where you felt included, where you felt truly seen, and where you felt a sense of belonging, that your voice could be heard and that your own experiences were valid. Can you think about that time? And I hope that that brings to the surface a really positive feeling in you. And I really hope that everyone who's joining on this call today has been able to have this kind of experience, whether it's been at home, within education, within your workplace, or in your community. And I think the contrast between those two experiences that I asked you to recall, on the one hand exclusion and on the other hand inclusion, is a pretty stark one. And when it comes to our workplaces, it really underscores why we should be striving for inclusion in all our places of work, both in Aotearoa and around the world. As I've mentioned, here in Aotearoa, we live in a very unique bicultural context of Te Ao Māori and Tauiwi people. But multiculturalism also characterises many of our regions, and in some areas, super diversity is the norm, especially in Tamaki Makaurau. And diversity is a daily part of our reality living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I've put this beautiful quote from the poet and writer and activist Maya Angelou up on this slide. And she says that we should all know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry. And we must understand that the threads, all of the threads of the tapestry, are equal in value, no matter what their colour. And I think that's a really important reminder to us all, especially as we start to dig into this conversation around cultural competence. And I think it's this richness of perspectives in workplaces that is so important. And also research shows us that having a range of cognitive and life experience diversity among employees, for example, cultural and ethnic differences, neurodiversity, a range of physical abilities, gender diversity, and a range of ages, actually leads to outcomes in the workplace. And diversity, it has been shown through a wide range of research, actually is lead to better decision making, greater creativity and innovation, and better outcomes for people. And that's both people working in a workplace and for organisations that serve people, better outcomes for the people that they serve. Equity is the other important concept alongside diversity that I want to touch on today. And equity relates to creating equitable and just outcomes. Essentially, this involves addressing historic and persisting social injustices and discrimination. And in Aotearoa, systemic injustices and inequities such as structural racism and discrimination against tangata whenua and Pacific people has led to incredibly inequitable outcomes across a range of areas of life, such as education, employment, health, and housing. And these are the kinds of things that we have to address through our efforts, focusing on diversity and equity. And I believe that in Aotearoa, we all have a part to play in honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So turning then to cultural competence, what does it mean and is it enough? So cultural competence can be understood as behaviours, attitudes, practices, policies and structures which enable systematic, sustainable and effective ways of working or providing service delivery in culturally diverse situations. And cultural competence is a developmental process that can be seen to evolve over a period of time, and both individuals and organisations are often at various levels of awareness, knowledge and skills when it comes to cultural competence. And a really interesting source of knowledge in this regard is the National Centre for Cross-Cultural Competence at Georgetown University. And an academic there, practitioner called Cross, developed out of that centre a cross-cultural competence continuum. And the Cross framework emphasises that the process of achieving cultural competency is seen to occur along a continuum and goes through a number of stages. So, for example, going from cultural destructiveness and cultural incapacity to cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, cultural competency, and cultural proficiency. And systems and organisations that really exemplify cultural competence demonstrate an acceptance and respect for cultural differences are seen to actually take very active steps to focus on this in their work. I also like to argue that we must go beyond this as well and actually work in culturally safe and culturally responsive ways, meaning that it's safe for all people of all cultures to work within an organisation and for all cultures to receive and experience services or use that organisation's services. And I think that this is especially important in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in light of some of the significant challenges that we have around equity and systemic racism. In Aotearoa, I would argue that being culturally safe and responsive also means consistently acknowledging tangata whenua as the Indigenous people of the land, the first people who were here, and the relevance of Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a founding document of Aotearoa. It also means for us who are tauiwi that we need to be making efforts in learning about Te Ao Māori, engaging in Te Ao Māori and exercising competence in tikanga Māori. And when we're providing services to Māori, doing that in safe and responsive ways. And in my work in the social sector, that's particularly relevant. So what do we need to focus on when we're building workplaces, communities and societies that are truly grounded in diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging? What can this look like? And you'll see on my slide here, I'm saying that to me, this is about collective action. We all have a part to play in creating this kind of environment where diversity of all kinds is truly embraced and valued. And I've learned this myself in a number of ways. For example, working in the Netherlands, it was quite a different culture. And I found through my work there, I was working for UNICEF at the time, and Dutch was the predominant language spoken in the workplace. I didn't really understand much Dutch at all. But what I learned through that was that taking the time to understand people and communication was absolutely key. I also learned the importance of persevering through misunderstandings because they do happen when we're working in cross-cultural environments. I guess it was at this time as well that I also started to dig into this concept of unconscious bias and also learning more about structural racism and discrimination. Questioning my own biases, because we all and interrogating what sits behind those assumptions became something really important to me and something that I continue to do to this day. Our minds have evolved to the point where they want to keep ourselves safe. And so our minds often unconsciously categorize and make judgments about people. So when we actually take the steps to be conscious that our brains are doing that and be prepared to change our minds, it can really be a game changer in our lives and in the workplace. Here in Aotearoa, I've really focused through my work and through my education on focusing on this importance of both language and culture and the importance that that can play in your career and in creating inclusive workplaces. So I've had the opportunity to learn up to a beginner level Te Reo Māori. That's a continuing journey for me, but it's not just about the language, it's also about the tikanga, about the ways of the culture. And what I've learned through this is that sometimes it's really important to take a risk, put yourself out there before you maybe feel like you're ready to, but always do that with respect and with care. And then the last thing I would say about my own experiences is that in my own work, focusing on children's rights, here in Aotearoa in particular, far too many children have told me and told others who work in this space that they are experiencing discrimination, bias and stigma on a daily basis. This just shouldn't be the case. Everyone should be able to grow up as living who they are, feeling like they belong and are included. Ultimately, that's what we want as human beings. So we need to really focus on meeting other people where they are, valuing their perspectives, and ultimately looking out for one another is really important. And I just share here this beautiful whakatauki from whakatoaki, actually, from King Tawhio. It says, ki te kotahi te kākaho ka whati, ki te kāpuia e kore e whati. And that essentially, the essence of it translates to, when we stand alone, we are vulnerable, but when we are together, we are unbreakable. And I think that really speaks to the value of diversity, both in our workplaces and in our societies. So my moemoea, or dream or aspiration, is to you all, in your work and in your studies and in your careers, to remember our common humanity as people. Seek to find common ground. Actually, there's much more that we have in common with one another than what divides us. The Te Ao Māori concept of whakawhanaungatanga, of taking the time to actively build connections and understand one another, is a really important practice that you can implement yourself in your work and in your life. For example, if you're running a meeting and you are running an icebreaker, challenge everyone to pair up and find 5 things that everyone has, that they have in common with one another. And it'll be amazing the kinds of connections and little linkages that come out through that. So find the threads that we can actually use to build bridges of understanding with one another. And I think that's so important as we continue through this pandemic time and continue to recover. We need to recognise that everyone's experience will be different, but everyone has a valuable perspective to bring to the table. Just want to touch briefly then, before I finish up and go into Q&A, on what organisations and workplaces can do when it comes to supporting cultural competence and safety and responsiveness. So organisational leaders have a real duty to champion this kaupapa and to do the mahi themselves, really do their own research to understand how they can best champion diversity and inclusion and make a personal effort to lead that in organisations. We also need to ensure our organisations are psychologically safe, grounded in trust, transparency, listening and learning. I believe that these are the real building blocks for inclusion. Workplaces need to be places where diverse perspectives are actively welcomed and have a bearing on decision making, and places where change is actively embraced and challenge to traditional power structures is something that organisations are open to, so that they can be rebuilt in ways that are fit for purpose for our world today. And then what can you yourself do? Because I believe we all have a part to play in this. So first of all, the process of being self-aware of your own biases and be self-reflective to challenge your own thinking is really important. Knowing and understanding your values and what drives you and what you believe is important too. Stay curious and take the time to listen and to learn. Take up all the opportunities to learn more. I've never once regretted saying yes to an opportunity to learn about another culture or connect with people of diverse experiences to me. Stay open to this. Keep an open heart and an open mind. And practicing deep and active listening is a key practical way that you can do this. Make sure that you don't ever assume to know someone else's experience, but do try and put yourself in their shoes to try and understand their perspective. And recognise that everyone comes with strengths and with something to add. And finally, just urge you to be conscious about how you play your part in creating truly inclusive societies, communities, workplaces that are grounded in diversity and that are increasingly more equitable. We can do this one workplace, one community at a time. So I'm going to leave it there, but I really welcome your pātai, and I look forward to having a bit of a discussion now together. Nō reira, nā koutou, e nā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I totally agree. It's all about one workplace at a time when we're tackling these issues together. I really enjoyed hearing about your journey, grappling with this idea of what diversity and inclusion really mean, both in the workplace and just through your journey of learning more about it. Just a quick reminder to everyone, do submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be taking a look at those questions. When I was thinking about some of the things that you were saying, Claire, one thing that really stood out to me was this idea of mindset, specifically how our thinking influences our attitudes and behaviors to those that are different to us. I know you were talking about these kinds of stereotypes that we use, and I know from experts and like Malcolm Gladwell in his book Talking to Strangers, it's this idea that we use these visual cues to automatically filter people and situations, so that we know, oh, it's safe to be in this environment, or people that look like this or look different or whatever, it might not be safe to engage with them, etc. We make these assumptions so many times throughout our daily lives, and some of them are right, some of them are wrong, and some actually end up having the potential to disadvantage or ignore other people. Have you found anything useful in terms of stopping yourself or from doing this kind of thing? And is there anything that you've any process that you've gone through that has been helpful in that regard, in your daily life, or even just leading other people?
Great question, Joel. And I think for me, it really comes back to that process of self-reflection, and being prepared to not only acknowledge your own view of the world and how that has been shaped, so being self-aware about that to start with, but then actually being prepared to start to unpack that a bit and challenge it, and to know how to sort of catch yourself when you do, because we all do it. It's just how human beings are wired. None of us are perfect in this regard. But when you do catch yourself doing that, actually create that space between you and the thought, and actually go, hold on, why did I have that reaction or that thought, or jump to that conclusion? What is it that sits behind that? What is my belief that maybe underpins that? And then seek to actually challenge that thinking. So maybe go and do some reading about it. Watch, there's some great videos that are online where you can actually go to learn about some of these things. I was listening to an amazing talk recently between Aiko Bethea and Brene Brown about creating inclusive, culturally safe workplaces, and just immersing in some of those things regularly is a way that I also just ensure that I'm staying on point and continuing to challenge my own thinking. I think as well, something else that I have done and that I hope others have done or will seek to do in future is just any opportunity that you get to actually engage and immerse in another culture, or another way of being, is always going to be a positive experience, I believe. And I've been fortunate to work in a number of places, where multicultural lunches and events and celebrations have been the norm. And I always have taken the opportunity to actually use those as opportunities to learn, to add to my knowledge about other cultures. And as I said, I found that incredibly enriching for myself personally.
Amazing. Well, I think we'll dive into the questions here. Our first question is, how would you deal with someone with a low level of cultural competence, particularly within a senior position?
Oh, great question. And I have to say that, I talked a bit in what I shared about the role of leaders. in organisations. And I've really emphasised that that might be right from, you know, the CEO of a corporation, a corporate commercial corporation, right through to someone who's leading something very grassroots, a volunteer organisation maybe. Leaders who are in roles of authority in organisations have, I believe, a duty and an obligation to actually lead the way on this kaupapa. But how you would challenge someone in that situation, I think that is a really hard thing to do. But advice off the top of my head, see if you can actually create a safe space to have that conversation with them. And when you do that, be ready to, I guess, explain and share why the situation is not how you believe it should, why your organisation perhaps is not functioning in a culturally safe and responsive way, and bring to the table some, you know, evidence and examples like what I've shared today around the positives that can be created when we take these kinds of approaches. I think the case for being culturally competent, safe and responsive in our work, the business case is there. It is very sound. It's rock solid. The evidence is ready to be drawn on. So bring that to the table, but also be prepared to be a bit vulnerable if you feel safe to be able to talk about how the situation is affecting you and some solutions that you think can happen.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was coming to mind was this whole analogy of one twig can snap, but if you have a whole bundle of twigs, it's very hard to break it very easily. So that's great advice. Let's go to the next question here. What is the most important attribute colleagues or employees can bring to a role in order to develop their cultural competence?
I think the most important attribute, to be honest, is just, as I said, openness, a sense of an open mind and an open heart. For me, myself as a leader, I always seek to be open to new perspectives, to learn, to recognise that I won't always have the answers, and to be able to draw on the knowledge and expertise of one another. You know, e hara takutoa I te toa takitahi, engari he toa takitini. My strength is not mine on my own. It comes from the collective. So recognizing that as a leader is a really important skill set to have, and also being prepared to be open to challenge your thinking and to reimagine how we can do things and to actually act on that together with others.
Awesome. And I think we can combine a couple of these questions. I think when it goes back to some of the things that you were saying about those root causes. I think the distrust and the fear are some of the root causes of sort of inequity and discrimination. And one of our audience members has said, how can young professionals overcome the fear to express ourselves from a cultural perspective at work? Maybe could you address that in terms of fear and also just maybe distrust of other people?
Absolutely. I think that being fearful and distrusting, unfortunately, is a completely understandable experience. And I think that for many of us who are from an ethnic minority or a different culture, we have had some experience of this, and I know that it's not easy. But I think as well, being prepared to actually be brave and to step into a space of vulnerability can also be very empowering. But then I think choosing how you do that is important too. Do that perhaps when you have others around you, or where you feel that there's a safe and supportive space for you to be able to do that. Something that I've also found has been very supportive for me is being part of a range of different networks or organisations that have a focus on valuing diversity and cultural diversity. So, for example, for the last 5 years or so, I've been a member of the Asian New Zealand Foundation Leadership Network. That's brought me into contact with a whole network of people, both from Asian backgrounds, Māori backgrounds, Pacifica backgrounds, Pākehā backgrounds, but we're all brought together by a shared valuing of diversity, a shared connection or interest in Asia. And so that's also something that you can do if you're feeling a bit fearful. Maybe reach out to some networks where you know you're going to find some like-minded people. And maybe that'll also help to build your confidence to challenge the status quo and to stand up for diversity and inclusion and equity.
Yeah, it's all down to the connections that we have. I think I'll try to combine these questions as well. You highlighted equity as important. Being asked a question about equity in particular, having a commitment to the treaty, is now part of interview questions when applying for roles. I feel inadequate in this area, but very eager to learn and believe in equity. Any advice on how to authentically and honestly answer this question? It's hard not to feel judged. And one of our other audience members has said something about teaching this in schools as a way to sort of build equity awareness with children and helping them to feel safe.
A big question. And I think, to be honest, like the best thing that you can do is to learn. And that's no matter what age you are, no matter what stage you're at in your career, it's never too late to learn. I know for me, myself, I'm still absolutely on a learning journey when it comes to te tiriti, te ao Māori, te kanga me te reo Māori. And I'll always be on a journey. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So having that orientation to learning is really important. And yes, those feelings of inadequacy and not knowing, acknowledge those, sit with those, but then also empower yourself to learn. And there's some amazing resources out there. So for example, I'd highly recommend a beautiful book called Reimagining Decolonisation. Start with the essay by Moana Jackson. He's an incredible leader in this space, and you'll be your mind will be opened in new ways. Also learn about the history of Aotearoa New Zealand, learn about te tiriti, about the te reo Māori version of te tiriti. And also when you have the opportunity to engage in te ao Māori, take up those learning opportunities humbly and with care and with respect, and you will find that people will get alongside you and support your own learning journey as well.
Yes, I think that's a great final piece of advice for us, that openness and that willingness to learn throughout our careers. It's something that we can all take with us. And I want to thank you so much, Claire, for that. And thank you, everyone, for your questions, attention, and participation. We're unfortunately out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. But it's been Claire and I's pleasure to discuss going beyond cultural competence, global insights on equity and diversity with you today. The Connect and Develop series brings you professional development talks covering topics designed to help you understand and adapt to the changing world of work. Although today was the final talk of this year's series, the conversation doesn't end here. Please do continue to connect with fellow members of the Alumni Connect community by following the link on your screen or in your inbox. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope to see you again next year, and be well.